So I'm Andrew, and the guy stealing the mics off of Matthew now is Scott. And we, as Matthew was talking about, come from a very multidisciplinary department. So I am, by background, an 18th century constitutional historian, which I realise sounds fascinating. Scott's PhD is in cooking plants, and we have worked together for 6 or 7 years now, and part of the duty in our department is explaining to each other the types of approaches that we take, the types of work that we do, and why we do it in that way. So from having worked together for a long time and then having a department that is very broad, so we have chemists, we have mathematicians, we have English lit folks, and we have education folks all working together in a round glass building. We have to try and explain the concepts and explain the ideas that we have, and then justify the approaches that we take. So what we're going to do today is talk a little bit about some of the work that I've done, and then Scott will talk a little bit about some of the work that he's done, and then we'll try and kind of loop that back together into talking about X. All right. So we in English language have a problem, and the problem is that the structures of information around about the words that we have are historically locked into dictionaries. The structure of the dictionary is such that the words are arranged in an alphabetical order, and you cannot really take any meaning out of that other than here is the alphabetical order of those words. That's problematic if, like me, you are a historian who's interested in ideas and interested in concepts and interested in the development of ideas and concepts over time. So what happened in the 1960s in Glasgow was an eccentric group of academics decided to announce that they were going to tear out every single page of every edition of the Oxford English Dictionary and dictionaries of Old English, and then start to catalogue and categorise those words based not on where they sat in the alphabet, but based on the meanings, the concepts and the ideas that the words that we have were. So they ripped out the pages. They ticked off each one as they went through, and then they wrote down, because it was the 60s, they wrote down each individual word, its definition, and then when that was used. From the 1960s until this was to publish the Thesaurus, until the Thesaurus was published in 2009, this is the process that we went through. So this was a humongous 40-year task published here at Glasgow. What this resulted in was we can see then that we have almost 800,000 words in the history of English up until the kind of mid-20th century. 800,000 words from Old English, so 800-ish AD, up to mid-20th century. English has continued to expand since then. So a couple of years ago, English hit its 1 millionth word, which was Web 2.0. But we already knew this. But what the Thesaurus allowed us to see was that from meanings, we have 225,000 different meanings, different concepts, and different ideas that we can talk about in English. So as speakers of English, throughout our history, we have been able to talk about 225,000 different types of things in different types of ways. English is the only language that you can do this for. There is no other language on earth that has this historical thesaurus. And so for me, what that means is I can start to come in as a historian and start to use this information, use these ideas to explain past concepts. Right. So what we see then is that on average, there are 3.5 words per meaning, per concept, but the language doesn't work like that. So there are some meanings with really, really specific terminology, really specific ideas that have a few words. And then in English, we have two major obsessions. The first one is stupidity, dullness, blockhead. We have about 250 words to describe somebody who is stupid, who is an idiot, who's a blockhead, who's a moron. Right? English is obsessed with calling other people idiots. Right? Our second most common, or one of our second biggest categories is it's one that shifts over time. So at the start, it is a word that means now, instantaneously. I need this now. And over time, that shifts to mean soon, soonish, later. So this category of these words that mean now is one of our biggest concepts, because the strength of those meanings change over time. Right? So as a historian then, what that allows me to do is see that when we're investigating the past, there are concepts and there are ideas and there are understandings that change over time. And one of the things that a historian has to do is try and remove themselves from any judgment that we have from now and place ourselves in the context of the past. And so understanding the word choices, understanding the types of words, the types of information that past speakers of English had in order to categorize and understand concepts allows us to better investigate what's happening there. So where I come in then is I am a political historian. There is a switch inside my head that says, talking about a group of dead white men from the 18th century discussing the Constitution is endlessly fascinating, and I will talk about this, as the folks in my department know, without pause and without end. But I'm really, really interested in how parliamentarians categorise and catalogue and map concepts and map ideas. Right? And we're still doing that now, right? So we are still trying to figure out what things mean, how things work, why things do things in the way that they do them, whether successfully or not, all right? So, as an example of this, if we take the concept of incivility, what it means to be uncivilized, throughout the history of English, there have been 42 words to describe people who are uncivilized. Right? So this is an excerpt from the Historical Thesaurus. The Historical Thesaurus is pages and pages of these types of concepts, and then the words that are arranged underneath that. Right? We have 42 words to describe somebody who is uncivilized. So the way this works is the top right there is the oldest terminology, and then it goes down through to the newest. Okay? This has some amazing words. So like scythical is the sword, the scythe. Other words like mountainous and tramontane, which is a brilliant word, and I encourage us all to use this. All examples of quotes from it are this kind of like dandy-esque forced thing of, if you think this is this thing that would be so tramontane, and it's just this brilliant, beautiful word. It literally just means beyond the mountains. It's Italians saying that Germans are uncivilized. But it's this beautiful example of this word that popped up for a while and we don't really use anymore, all right? So if we look at that and investigate that, then I think that we see that there are 5 what I call sense families. These are arranged over time. So they start off by thinking about how people are categorized as being uncivilized based on being wild, being animalistic. Over time that then changes to mean crude, rough, unpolished, unfinished. In the 13th, 14th, and 15th centuries, we then get barbar, which comes from the Greek word for people who did not speak Greek. So to Greeks, people who didn't speak Greek sounded like they were saying bar, 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 bar. In English, we would say blah, 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 blah. Then with the development of the state in the 14th, 15th, 16th, 17th centuries, we get the dominant concept here of uncivilized, outside of the state. And then as speakers of English came increasingly into contact with people that they categorize as being different, you get this concept of the other. I am X, you are Y, and we are different because of that. Right? And they tend to be the words now that we are most uncomfortable with. Right? We don't tend to use the words around the other anymore. So, mostly because I like to say bar, 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 bar on repeat, let's focus a little bit on barbarians. So these are all the words that we have had to describe barbarism, what it means to be barbaric. Right? Initially, as you can see in the Sydney Smith quote here, the connotations of sound remained. So when shall I see Scotland again? Never shall I forget the happy days I passed there amid osiest smells, barbarous sounds, bad suppers, excellent hearts, and most enlightened and cultivated understandings. Right? Which, if you spent any time in Sauchiehall Street, for example, you would know this to be the case. Right? But there, you've got this idea of barbarous sounds, but also cultivated understandings. And to us now, that seems an odd mix-up. Then swap to the 20th century, and you've got Americans are the only race which passed directly from barbarism to decadence without knowing civilization. Right? So that connotation of sound then has gone, right? And we're focused just on the Americans being barbaric in this case. Okay. So what that does then is allows us to see that this concept of civility, this concept of what it means to be civilized, changes over time. Right? And we as speakers of English have catalogued and categorise these in different ways over time. So civilization is a movement, not a condition, it's a voyage, not a harbour. And our definitions continue to change. Right? So how we describe this continues to change. If we extrapolate that out into English language as a whole, so this is modern day English language, we have at the moment about 500,000 words that we can pick from. The way this works is older, or Old English is black, older words are darker yellow, newer words are brighter yellow. So you get this kind of stretch patch effect where modern day English has expanded to meet the needs of speakers. So you can see there, if we take it up, you've got the world, the social world, and the mental world as the three components. And you can see that subjects like physics and chemistry are new, are bright. Travel, there's a little bit in here, which is aeroplanes. And then faith is much, much older. Right? And again, English is the only language that you can do this for. So it's the only language where you can see how this is built up in this way. Okay. So what we have then as an example of my research is going from the work that other people did here in little bits of paper, taking that up into, here's an example of 42 words, and we can start to investigate how parliamentarians and how politicians spoke about concepts and spoke about ideas, and then take that up into, this is what English as a language looks like. Do you need a clicker?
We have a problem. The problem that I'm going to focus on is to do with the planet that we live on. So what you can see here is a plot of the population from back when we started doing reliable counts of how many people there are on the planet, or things that we can extrapolate that from, up until the modern day. So to the year 2000 is this second last notch along the bottom, and then beyond that is kind of beyond where this graph was created. And so what you've got then is a line that splits into three, and those are UN projections on how many people there will be on the planet in three scenarios. A worst case scenario when the rate continues as it is, a medium case scenario where it levels out, and a best case scenario if you consider if you consider this number of people that we have on the planet right now to be too many, where it starts to go back down. But we have a problem. The planet is dealing with more people on its surface than it has ever had to deal with before. The knock-on effect of that, or one of them, is that you have to find places for all of these people to live, but at the same time, you have to find places to grow the food, which is kind of the other essential part of sustaining human life. And there's a limited number of square miles on the planet, so we're going to run out of space for one or the other of these things eventually. So maybe I'm not here to tell you we've got a problem. Maybe it's worse. Maybe we've got two. Then compounding that is the fact that we're living on a planet where the environment is changing in a way that certainly during human civilization times it's never changed before. So what you can see on this map of the world is a red dot, or it's a heat map, but pay attention to the red dots, which are mainly around North India there, where it's too hot at the moment to grow rice. And I choose rice because it's a staple crop that millions and millions of people around the world rely on for most of their calories, which is what keeps them alive. That's 2000. In the year 2050, by the same point as the end of that graph I just showed you, here's what scientists who study this project the situation will be. Red dot, too hot to grow rice. If it's too hot to grow rice, it's too hot to grow a lot of other things as well. So, to give you an idea of what that means for those plants, you've got plants that run out of water. You're familiar with seeing this if you don't water your houseplants. That's drought. If you water a plant that's been droughted, it'll recover most of the time. That's not the problem with these red dots. What's happening there is that the plants are getting so hot where they stand that they literally cook in the soil. And you can't come back from a shriveled up brown dead leaf. So maybe we have three problems. Unprecedented high population, limited land available to grow food, which is what people need to stay alive, and a changing climate, which puts more challenges on top of that. The one that, as a biologist, that I can try to tackle is that third one, the climate change. So I want to take you sideways to think about food. So when you fry an egg, you've got an egg that's got a yolk and it's got a white inside and it's a liquid, and when you crack it, it drops into the pan. The pan is hot, and as the temperature goes up, what happens in that white, which is mainly protein, and the way that I usually like to think of proteins is like some kind of ball of wool, or maybe to update that analogy, like a charger cable, right? The protein is a string that's coiled up into a very particular shape, and if it's in that shape, it does its job and it's fine. When the temperature goes up, everything starts to shake around. That's what a high temperature is. And eventually you end up in a situation where all of the unraveled chargers get tangled in each other. So that's what's happening with the proteins in your egg white. And that's one of those situations that there's no coming back from. You can't take molecular hands and untangle your egg white. So same thing happens inside of a plant cell. It's just that you can see it on an egg. And so plants have got a natural mechanism to try to stop this happening. I like to think of it as the blue fuzzy hug monster, because that came from a campaign for advertising cup of soup a few years ago. Cup of soup was like a big cuddly hug. Actually, it's the same shape and does the same job as the proteins that I was interested in. They are things that come on when the temperature goes up, and they go around and they essentially hug all of the nicely wrapped up proteins and stop them from unraveling so that you don't get as far as the unrecoverable egg white fried situation. So, come with me to a more genetically familiar diagram. Proteins that are in their normal shape, doing their job, are on the left. As the temperature goes up, they start to unravel, and if the temperature keeps being too high, eventually you get to the irreversible egg situation. Down in the bottom, that blue blob is our hug monster. And what the plants do is they send out what these proteins in the plants do is they send out their arms, they catch these ones that are starting to unravel, and just take them off to the side before they get too far. And this is where my research happened. Because we thought, okay, plants do this. It's not perfect because plants are still dying when the temperature is too high. Can we make that better by having these genes that make these blue hug monster proteins always on rather than just being there when the temperature goes up? And will that make them more tolerant of the, as Andrew says, the cooking situation? This is where I get a reputation as being either a botanist, a gardener, or a cooker in my PhD. So this is my one standout result. This is what my whole PhD led to. Plants on a Petri dish. On the left-hand side, you've got the plants that are normal, and it's not very clear up there, but there is a division line down the middle. On the right-hand side of that line, you've got plants that have been given a version of that blue fuzzy hug monster protein that's always on. And so we thought, if we put this plant in the oven and see what happens to it afterwards, will this prove that our gene is more successful? Yes, was the answer. The plants aren't all green, they're not totally green, but if you're a farmer and these are your crops, that's the difference between having nothing to eat or nothing to sell and having something, having 50, 60% of what you would in a perfect situation. So, what I'm trying to show you is that while my life for 3.5 years was standing in a fluorescently lit room with a lab coat and gloves and moving tiny volumes of colourless liquid from one tube into another, what we were actually doing in that research group was finding ways to make plants more tolerant of high temperatures, because then you can grow them in places where it's too hot or too dry to grow them right now. And if you can do that, then you're one step closer to being able to feed the world. Pause for effect. So hopefully what Andrew and I have done is shown you that really, really mundane, boring situations doing research, for him it was tearing pages out of a book, and for me it was doing that, are fine and really interesting to other people who do that job, but you're not people who do that job. So we all have to find ways of telling each other about what we do.
Thank you. Yeah, so as part of that, what Scott and I are really, really keen on is this research conversation and getting as many people as possible engaged with the research that they are doing, engaged with talking about the research that they're doing, and then engaging other people in the research that they're doing. So as Scott says, our research, the actual research tasks that we undertook, fundamentally are really, really boring. Like I catalogued and categorized politicians' speeches. I can tell you what particular politicians had for breakfast on the 24th of April, 1763. Right? That fundamentally isn't really that interesting to anybody except me. Scott, as he said, moved colourless liquid and cooked, and that did something. But what we then get out of that is, here is what this means, what this does, what this shows, and what this tells us, and why this is important, and how we can then use that to achieve something, to do something. So with things like X, what we were really keen to try and promote was this idea of this personal, national, or global significance of the research that we undertake here. Right? Whether that is something that is a reflection on what you do and improvement because of that, whether it's something that offers national significance or global impact, and trying to sell and package that as something important. We also have a duty in this beautiful, fantastic, amazing building, which is paid for by the state, to educate the public, to engage the public in some fashion. And increasingly for academics and for academia, that is important. Right? Getting the public on side is important. And things like Talk About X are one of the ways in which we try and say, look at what our amazing, fantastic undergraduates do at this research-intensive university with this amazing big building. Isn't this so cool? Isn't this so engaging? Isn't this so interesting? And then we do that through that, as we were talking about, this multi-direction, multi-discipline conversation, where you have physicists talking to creative writing people, and most of the time those two groups would not meet, and if they do meet, it's a really uncomfortable social encounter where they both look at each other as if neither of them is in any way human, and why would you ever want to do that, but trying to convince the opposite side that actually we all have something of worth to contribute to promoting national, global, or personal significance and growth. So, is this me or you? Yeah. So, for thinking about why we did this then for X, what we were keen, as Matthew was talking about, and as we were saying at the start, is our department is here to promote and enhance students' academic abilities. And we want to do that in practice. And X is the space to allow our undergraduates to show off, to parade the things that they have done. We were also, and have been, so we started this, as Matthew was saying, 5 years ago, and Scott and I and the rest of the department have been consistently astounded by the undergraduates' contribution to knowledge, that most of the time is lost. Right? It's a dissertation that you write and then submit to your dissertation supervisor, who's maybe also the marker, end of process, which is the same thing as happens with PhDs. Right? You submit it to your two markers, you then talk about it with them in a room at the end, and then that's it. Right? So that having the space to showcase the undergraduates' contribution to knowledge is so important, we think. And allowing us to do that allows us the space to show off all the things that you do and why that matters so much.
And so after the first one and the second one in 2012 and 2013, we asked the students who took part, how did you feel about it? Was it actually any good for you? Because we thought it was a good idea, but we weren't sure. One said, in their normal lives when they're not here, you're always with like-minded students and peers and you think everyone knows this, it's obvious, but it's not. So it's actually good to come here to try to explain it, also for myself in easier terms, because it's not always going to be an academic audience, you know? And she actually went on to say later, with love and knowledge, if you share it, it doesn't disappear. So I feel like I'm sharing the knowledge and it doesn't disappear. I was like, I didn't know it and now I do, and I'm going to tell you about it because it's valuable and it's worth knowing. And our last quote, someone else said, people in my year get surprised, I think this was either a third year it must have been, when I say I've done research. The thing is, I don't think they really want to do research, so they're probably going to go and get normal jobs. And the other thing is, I think they think it's too early to be doing research. If we have ideas, I don't think it's ever too early.
So part of this, as again Matthew was talking about a wee bit, is the mentoring process of getting through the mentoring process, the ability to communicate these ideas across the discipline divides, across the subject divides. It's unique to X, nobody else does it in this particular way, pairing up, the example that we always go to is pairing up a creative writing PhD with an astrophysicist undergraduate and putting them in a room together and then seeing what happens at the end. That's unique. And what we're looking to do there is both develop students' presentation skills, students' research communication skills, and develop, as Matthew was talking about again, the ability of the PhD students to work hands-on with students and to try and promote that. So that's kind of the rationale and the ethos behind Talk About X, and also Exposition, which is our upcoming undergraduate research journal, which you can also find on talkaboutx.net. So there'll be a call for papers coming out for Exposition. So the difference between Exposition is it's in written format. So if you don't particularly want to stand on the front and a stage, but still have amazing, fantastic ideas that you want to share, write them down and put them into Exposition. All of the past journal entries are up there. There are examples around about nuclear power, a whole host of other different types of subjects from across the range that you can imagine. Take a look, see how they've done it, see how they've written about their subjects through Exposition, and then think about submitting for the call that's coming out in the next couple of weeks. Otherwise, thanks very much, and the students will be up next.